Everybody. Welcome. It's True Crime Wednesday. I hope you're all doing great. I must admit, I'm still a little slow from getting back from CrimeCon. I had a blast, and I want to tell you all about it. So I'll open with that while we wait for some of our people to join us. CrimeCon was fun. It was in Orlando. I went last year when it was in Las Vegas, and I have got to say, it's probably doubled in size since last year. And it was enormous. There were somewhere around 3,000 people in a lot of the breakout sessions. So it was amazing. I got to visit with lots of other creators. It was great fun. We missed Scott Reich. He wasn't there because he had a trial. But I saw Gigi, saw Joel Waldman, gosh, I can't even remember all the people that I said hello to, connected to, got to meet in person. So that was really great. And then there were a lot of informational and kind of educational sessions. And there was a lot of interesting sessions. When we get to the point where we're talking about Murdoch, then I will talk a bit about one of the sessions that I attended. For those of you who have been following our channel for a while, y'all know I'm writing a book. Y'all know that my first draft is due to the publisher the end of the year, and that we are hoping that we're going to be able to start pre-sales at CrimeCon next year, which is May 31st. I'm going to put this in all of our show notes, and we'll be telling you about it at length. But mark your calendars, because we are going to be launching the book for pre-sales at CrimeCon May 31st through June 2nd of next year. And that is in Nashville. I've never been to Nashville, so I'm kind of looking forward to it. I was a little surprised that they didn't do something closer to the West Coast, but the darn thing is getting so big, I think they're limited on where they can hold it. I would not be surprised. There were 5,000 people there last year. I would not be at all surprised to learn that there were double there this year. So it was super fun, and I'm really glad I went. Orlando was great. I stayed at a hotel next door to the venue hotel, because they were already out of rooms when I signed up. And so it was a really nice hotel, and I got a little time around the pool, and it was really well worth the trip. And I had a lot of fun. One of the most fun things was opening night, which was Thursday night. There was a special event. It was a separately ticketed, so you had to buy a separate ticket for it, but it was so worth it. It was way fun. Creighton Waters, who was the prosecutor on the Murdoch case, is also a guitarist and plays in a band. And his band was there, and we did an opening night dance party, and it was amazingly fun. And it was wild and crazy because we were all wearing our flashy glasses and all of our neon stuff, and it was a hoot. They play a lot of cover music, and we had a blast. And it was so fun to see Creighton Waters in a different way. He was up there rocking out and having a really good time. He's a good guitarist, by the way. So that was super fun. There were 3 full days of seminars and meet and greets and opportunities to talk to people who are involved in true crime news coverage, as well as all kinds of different creators. They have what they call Podcast Row, which this year was very interesting because they really expanded the the types of booths and exhibitors, that's the word I was looking for, this year. And it was very interesting. There were a number of exhibitors that were there because they are the families or the of people who are missing. So there were quite a few people who were there to publicize a missing relative. It took me a little aback. There was a table that was manned by some women who were there representing an organization that is looking for missing people in southwestern Oregon. And it was really kind of interesting. I walked up and said, "Hey, I'm from Bend," and the woman reached down and picked up a card and handed it to me and said, "This is my sister, and she went missing in Bend." And it was really unsettling to look down at the picture and the name, which was a little bit of an unusual name, and realize that she was someone who I had represented in Bend. She had been had some minor drug charges, and she had some pretty serious mental health problems. And it was several years ago that she's been missing for several years. And I really felt for her sister. I told her I recognized her name, but I didn't really go into how I recognized her name. But it was a little sobering to realize that. It's certainly not the first time in my career that I had a client who went missing or died. I've had more than one client who committed suicide. I had a couple of clients that were murdered. So it just brought me back to why we're all doing what we're doing. Reminded me that we look at these cases and they're interesting. They have interesting facts, or they have interesting twists, or they make us think about thought-provoking things. But we should never lose sight of the fact that these are real people and they have real families and people who love them and miss them terribly. So it was a little sobering for me to have the card of someone who I had known handed to me as someone who's missing. And the podcast row was super fun. There were lots and lots of creators there. True Crime Garage. Oh gosh, I can't even begin to list all of the podcasters and YouTube creators that were there. So many of them. And it was fun to get to know them, see some of them, meet them, some of them for the first time. News Nation was there in force. Court TV was there in force. So it was great to see all those folks that I met during the Vallow trial here in Boise. So we have a lot to talk about tonight. I see that we've picked up the usual amount of folks for where we're at in the show. So I want to just move on into. We have a lot of cases to talk about. Now, probably the biggest news today, and y'all may not know this because it came out not too long ago, but just a couple of hours ago. But Suzanne Morphew's remains have been recovered and identified. That information came out today. Her body was located by law enforcement who stumbled across it when they were looking for someone else. And the medical examiner has confirmed that, in fact, the remains were those of Suzanne. She has been missing since May of 2020, so it's hard to say what sort of remains are left after 3 years. And in Colorado, the remains were located something like 50 miles or so away from where she lived. And it will be interesting to see what their next step is. Now, for those of you who don't remember, Barry Morphew, who was her husband, was arrested for her murder. And those charges were later dismissed because the prosecutor had violated some pretty substantial discovery rules. And the judge dismissed the charges. It was dismissed without prejudice, meaning that they could be refiled again. So we don't know what that means now that her remains have been found. I'm certain that we're going to hear more about the probable cause if, in fact, Barry is rearrested. I'm certain that we'll see a probable cause warrant, and we'll get more information about whether or not they've been actually able to link him to her death. He contends that he is innocent and that she was either kidnapped or was or left voluntarily. And there are some interesting twists in that case. An unidentified male's DNA was found in her car. So, and it did come out later that she was having a relationship with someone else, but the DNA didn't match the boyfriend. So I don't know. I don't know what we'll hear next, but I'm sure that we'll be hearing something soon. So that was the really big news of today. For those of you who tuned in and watched my live last week from CrimeCon, we talked at length about the 136-page motion that came out in the Delphi case. And I am going to get back to that, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. But there are a couple of other cases that I want to just touch on. Yesterday, Taylor Schabusiness was sentenced. It was very interesting for those of you who watched it. She came into court and she had on what appeared to be sort of a cross between a mask and a turtleneck, a neck gaiter, that covered her from the eyes down. That's a spit helmet. That is a spit mask. And they are typically used by law enforcement when you have someone who cannot behave themselves and who spits at law enforcement. I don't know why they had her in a spit mask, but I'm assuming it is because she has continued to act out since she was found guilty. She was sentenced, as we expected, to life without parole. For those of you who don't remember, she is the young woman who dismembered her boyfriend and in his mother's basement. I have also been keeping track of the Ruby Franke and Jody Hildebrandt trial, or case, not a trial yet. There's some really interesting information out there if you are at all inclined. And I do not, they are a Mormon family. They are an LDS family, and so the community of LDS members and former LDS members are very interested in this case. There is a podcast. I have put the links in our show notes so that you can find them. But there is a podcast called Mormon Stories. It is run by John DeLynn. John DeLynn has a doctorate in psychology, and he is a former member of the LDS Church. He certainly comes at it from a non-believing place, but I think of and I have watched a lot of them because of my work on the Vallow Daybell case. I have watched a lot of podcasts, both from people who are still active believers and people who have left the church. What I will say about John Dehlin is he makes it very clear that he is not a believer, but he tries, I think, pretty hard to be pretty balanced about his coverage. He has been particularly distressed by the Franke and Hildebrandt case. One of the reasons is because Jody Hildebrandt was on many, many referral lists, church-sponsored therapist referral lists, and probably 80% of her clients came from referrals from the church. And in many cases, her fees were paid for by the church, because if a bishop recommends that somebody go and see a therapist and they say, I'd love to, but I can't afford it, the church bishops have compassionate funds where they can pay for those things. So this has been really bothersome to John Dehlin and to the folks at Mormon Stories. So they've covered this case pretty widely. There is a very interesting, the link is in our show notes. There is a very interesting Mormon Stories program from last week that interviews Jody Hildebrandt's niece, who Jody had living with her and was treating her. And she claims that using the same tactics of starving and duct taping and a whole lot of other similar mistreatment to what the Franke kids experienced. So if you're at all interested in that case from that perspective, then I highly recommend Mormon Stories as a good source of information. Now, I'm going to tell you, I don't think it's for everybody, because there are folks who are believing members of the church who are going to find some of the things that John Dehlin is saying distressing and troubling. So I would say proceed with caution, but if you are at all interested, that is the place to go for that information. I want to talk, before we get to the two which we'll spend a bit of time on tonight, which is Delphi and Murdoch. I did want to touch on a couple of other cases. The Rex Heuermann Gilgo Beach murders. He had a court appearance today. It was a very brief court appearance. They talked some about discovery issues. There's already, now remember, we're only dealing with 3 potential victims, possibly a 4th. The DNA hasn't come back yet. And there are already 2 terabytes of information to be shared in discovery. So the judge wanted to be sure that Mr. Heuermann was actually able to access that and hopefully be able to review it. He did say that he was meeting with his lawyers and that he has been able to spend 2 to 3 hours a day reviewing it, really just scratching the surface of reviewing that discovery. Somebody asked if that was typical, and it absolutely is. Defendants should and must be able to view and review all of their discovery. And if that means sending someone down to the jail with a laptop and sitting there while the client goes through all that information, that's what's required. So there were a couple of other issues that came up. One had to do with the guns that were found in the house. apparently he has agreed that his wife can sell those guns. Now, you may remember that his wife lives in their home with her disabled son, and financially she's not in a great situation. And so she is asking permission of the court. Now, none of those guns, there's like 300 of them, none of those guns have been linked to any of these crimes. However, and I'm assuming they have all been tested, reports have been done, and she is asking to be able to turn those guns over to a dealer and allow them to be sold. It'll be interesting to see what the judge decides. I think the prosecution is going to object. They're going to say, okay, these guns are not related to the 4 homicides that we're currently prosecuting. However, we don't know what other crimes those guns could be linked to. And we want to be able to have those guns and retest them if it's necessary. So I don't expect that the judge is going to release those guns unless the prosecution agrees and says, sure, take them. There are a few new developments in the Corey Richens case. She has been accused of attempting to tamper with witness testimony. There were letters found in her jail cell that appeared to be letters she was writing to her mother and her brother, telling them what she needed them to say in their possible testimony. And she has now been, the prosecution has now asked for an order limiting her contact with anyone who might be a witness, including her own family. And I would not be surprised to see her charged with witness tampering. She claims these are just notes from, I'm writing a book, and they're just notes from a novel based on my own experience. So I am certain that there's nobody out there that really believes that that's what she was doing. And so I think that she is in trouble, and I think her case is in trouble. And the last thing I wanted to talk about before we get a little deeper into Delphi and Murdoch is to talk about the Adelson Markel case. Now, this is not a new case. This case is 8 years old. The case stemmed from let me set the scene. Dan Markel was a law school professor, was a Harvard law graduate, law school professor at Florida State University, FSU, in Tallahassee. He was married to his wife, Wendy, who now uses her maiden name, which is Adelson. Wendy came from a family of dentists. Her father had a very lucrative dental practice with several locations in the greater Miami area. And when she met Dan Markel, she was also a lawyer and is still a lawyer. And they had 2 little boys. And after several years, they got divorced. And in the process of that divorce, Wendy did not particularly enjoy living in Tallahassee. She was much more interested in living closer to her family in the Miami area. And so she, after the divorce, told him that she was going to take their young children and move to Miami. And it's a fair patch between Miami and Tallahassee, like across the state. So He wasn't thrilled because he knew that he was not going to be able to spend the kind of time he was spending with his boys if she moved. They had a parenting time agreement that essentially gave them about 50-50 time with the children. So he was a professor at the law school, and he contested her filed motions, and the court ordered that she could not move with the boys further away from Tallahassee. That if she was going to continue to have the same relationship with the children, it would have to be in Tallahassee, because that's where their dad was. And she was not a happy camper over it. More importantly, her family was not happy about it. They wanted her back in the Miami area. They wanted, they were angry at Dan Markel. They felt like he had not treated her kindly, and they wanted to do whatever they could to hurt him. They wanted her back close to them, and they were a very, very tight-knit, maybe unhealthily, overly involved kind of a family. So after that happened, 2 Hispanic men pulled up in a rental car and shot Dan Adelson in his driveway, kind of right inside his garage door. He was rushed to the hospital, where he survived for 13 days before he ultimately succumbed to his injuries and passed away. And it didn't take very long to connect a woman who had worked in the Adelson dental practice to these 2 men who had actually been the trigger men. But as the FBI and the Florida state law enforcement began investigating, they discovered that the woman who was working in the Adelson dental practice was also the girlfriend of Wendy Adelson's brother, Charlie, and that there were significant connections between her, the gunman, and Charlie Adelson. She and the 2 gunmen were eventually found guilty for in a murder for hire plot. However, no one has yet been convicted for being the person who arranged the murder for hire. But Charlie Adelson has been arrested and is in jail awaiting trial. He's been in custody now, I would say, I'd have to look for sure, but 1.5 to 2 years. He's attempted on a couple of occasions to get released on bail. The judge has denied it because these folks have a lot of resources, and he's very clearly a flight risk. So he is going to trial on the 28th of October. That trial, as far as we know, is going to be televised. The other trials were, and we're going to be following that one. It is a really interesting case. There are very clear communications between Charlie and his mother, who is also Wendy's mother, about this plot, but Wendy's mother has not been charged, at least not yet. But we don't know at this point whether Charlie Adelson, I think they had hoped that Charlie Adelson would roll on his mom, but I don't think that's happened. And in fact, they're prepared to go to trial. So it's a really interesting case. I'm actually toying with the idea of exploring whether or not that could be my next book. And so I'm going to be digging into it much deeper. Now, let's talk about Delphi and Murdoch. Let's start with Delphi. On the way down to CrimeCon, because it is I had to fly from Boise to Seattle, connect to a flight from Seattle, and fly from Seattle to Orlando. That's almost a 6-hour flight. So I had plenty of time to sit on my laptop and read all of the Delphi documents. So I read all 136 pages of the Delphi motion that the defense filed last week. So in a nutshell, to try and sort of condense this, in a nutshell, what the defense is saying is that there were other potential lines of investigation and other potential suspects who should have been investigated and were not. They were ruled out really quickly in the case, and law enforcement quite intently focused on connecting the bullet that they found between Libby and Abby's bodies to someone in the local community. That really became their focus. And they did that sort of to the exclusion of a lot of other potential evidence. And now the defense is saying that they used improper, they didn't tell the judge about these other avenues of investigation when they went to the judge and asked the judge for an arrest warrant and a search warrant for Richard Allen. So when they executed the search warrant on his home, they found that he had a gun that matched the profile extractor marks on the bullet that they found on the scene. Now, I want to point out this bullet was not, if you read the documents, wasn't just laying on top of the ground. It actually was under some leaves and some ground cover, and it didn't appear that it was something that someone had just dropped. So, but law enforcement were convinced that whoever was connected to that bullet was the perpetrator of the crime. There were many things that law enforcement didn't tell the judge, and those things were indications in the crime scene. If you are at all interested in the specifics, go back and watch last week's episode that I did from the hotel at CrimeCon. I was talking into my laptop, so the lighting's not great, sound's probably not that wonderful, but I did talk at length about what was in that motion. The defense was very specific, and they were very descriptive about the crime scene. And it was significant because of what they contend law enforcement overlooked or didn't think was important. So I went through the specifics of that. It is hard to listen to, and it is hard to read. So I tried to do it as delicately as possible, but there are some, trigger warning, there are some pretty explicit parts to that last week's episode. So I'm not going to dig into that deeply today, but I do want, because I don't want to go back through all that stuff. So, but what the defense said was there were indications at the crime scene that potentially these murders were cult motivated or cult connected. And so they identified a person who was a potential, who had a sort of loose connection to one of the girls. And they identified this person. But when the defense or I'm sorry, when the prosecution, when law enforcement went to a judge and said, Judge, we want to go search Richard Allen's house, they did not tell the judge that there were other potential suspects and other potential legal theories. An error of omission is as bad as a lie. And so the defense is saying the law enforcement got that warrant under false pretenses. They lied to the judge, and that the judge might not have issued that search warrant so readily if the judge had known that there were other potential suspects. So then we get into, so what they're saying is, Judge, we want you to throw out that search warrant as illegal. Now, what that means is, if the judge says, you're right, that was not a legal search warrant because law enforcement falsified information in order to get the search warrant, you're right. So if the judge says, you're right, it wasn't a legal warrant, anything that they seized in Richard Allen's home, including the gun, is going to be fruit of the poisonous tree. So what the law says is, and it's very well settled law everywhere in the country, if the police illegally obtain evidence, the proper search warrant, or they didn't get a search warrant, or for whatever reason they illegally obtain any sort of information, anything that's derived from something they seize in an illegal warrant is also illegal and can't come in. So if a judge were to say your warrant was no good, then the seizure of that gun that belonged to Richard Allen is illegal, and the analysis of the gun and the bullet is also illegal and doesn't come in. And that really is the only concrete evidence that links Richard Allen to the crime scene. We know that he owned similar clothing to the clothing that was in a blurry photo that was found on one of the girls' telephones. We know that he lived in the area and admitted that he had been on the bridge. But that in itself is not going to be enough to connect circumstantial evidence, link circumstantial evidence from Richard Allen to the crime. So this motion is pretty critical for the defense. If the judge were to rule that law enforcement had lied by omitting the information about other suspects when they got the warrant, then it is possible that Richard Allen, the case against Richard Allen, could implode. And they would have to come up with some other connection. And at this point, they have not been able to do that. So that's kind of a gee whiz. What the defense is contending is that there is a Viking Odin cult that exists in the Delphi area, and that cult includes white supremacists that are in the prisons as well as prison guards. And that one of the reasons why Richard Allen is being abused in prison is because there are connections to this Odin cult within the prison. That's a very brief overview, but it does give you an idea. Sorry, my dogs have decided to bark. It does give you an idea of where they are in the case. And I don't think we're going to see a trial anytime soon. And I do think that Richard Allen, from all we've seen, is in very poor health. He has his lawyers contend that he has been mistreated in prison and that they would very much like to have him released before he's seriously injured in prison. I don't know whether that is factual or not, but that's the defense allegations. And really, right now, it's all about whether or not the judge believes those. So I do think we're going to see a hearing on the issue of the warrant and whether or not the state lied fairly soon. The other issue is that the state now has filed their response. Richard Allen's attorneys filed a motion saying that they want cameras in the courtroom. They say it's for this very reason, because they want the public and government to know that they're being held accountable for this activity. They say sunlight is the best disinfectant. We want it all out there. We want to be able to show to the public and to the local government that this is a problem, that these people have infiltrated the prison, and that Mr. Allen is being victimized because of it. We want to be able to show, we want all of this done in the light of day. Well, the prosecution has come out and said, oh, we don't want cameras in the courtroom. And I thought it was very interesting. Court TV, Vinnie Politan had a segment about this today, and he was hot under the collar. And he made the point that the defense really wants cameras in the courtroom because they think the state is acting in bad faith, or that they're dirty, that there is some sort of collusion going on. Now, I did go into this a little bit in the last episode, but these Odinist cults are moving into the prisons because they are favorites of the white supremacist movements. The time was when the white supremacist movements that are in the jails and in the prisons, you got your swastika tattoos. Now they're all getting Odinist runes, Viking runes, symbols. And the defense contends that those same sort of symbols were left at the crime scene. So it's going to be interesting to see where they go from here. I expect that we're going to see a couple of hearings fairly soon about those two issues. Now, whether they'll be televised or not, we don't know. We're sort of in the same holding pattern that we are in the Brian Kohberger case, where the court still has not made a ruling on whether or not cameras are going to be allowed in the courtroom. I expect, since it's Idaho, that they're going to be looking very heavily at how the Vallow case was conducted, and it would not surprise me at all for them to make those same precautions and to say no cameras, but we will release the audio at the end of the day. And now on to Murdoch. So on the way down to CrimeCon, I read those 136 pages of motions in Delphi. And then on the way home, I read this little gem. This is Becky Hill, who is the clerk of the court. This is her book about the trial of Alec Murdoch and what it was like behind the scenes. It's not super long. There is a large section of photographs at the end that take up probably 20, 25 pages. So it's 170 pages is the text. And I found it interesting. I have some serious concerns about whether or not the clerk of the court should have been writing a book and expressing her opinions quite so freely in the book. Now, does that mean that she was also freely expressing her opinions to the jurors? I don't know. I don't think anyone knows at this point. The Murdoch's attorneys, Jim Griffin and Dick Harpootlian, who I'll talk about in a minute because they were at CrimeCon, contend that she was talking out of school, out of turn, and that she was saying things that could be construed as attempting to influence the jury. Now, one of the questions has to be, must it actually have impacted the jury's decision? Does the defense have to prove that there was some sort of actual damage, that it actually impacted their decision? Or is it enough to say there's a chance that it did? Now, they contend, and in their motion, supported by a lot of case law, they say it only needed to raise the possibility that it impacted the jury's decision. The state is taking the position that unless they can prove that a juror's mind was changed by what Becky Hill said, they're kind of going with the no harm, no foul argument. It appears to me in this case that Pootie and the grifter, as I affectionately call them, could be right in what the legal standard is for how the court decides whether or not they get Alec gets a new trial. I think that that constitutionally, the right to a fair and impartial jury is so fundamental that I think the state is going to say that if there is any possibility that anything Becky Hill said impacted a juror, he gets a new trial. Now, why are they doing this? Well, they're doing it because they mistakenly, I'm not even sure it's mistakenly, but I think the case unfurled and unraveled. The case came together in a way that ended up having Alec Murdaugh tried first for the murders in state court and then be charged with the financial crimes in federal court. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court has said that if you have two jurisdictions it's only possible if it's federal and state, because you can't commit a crime in two jurisdictions and have the same crime in two physical jurisdictions. Okay, so for example, Chad Daybell couldn't commit the same crime in Fremont County and in Madison County. The crimes were similar and they were all a course of conduct. And it's very possible that much of the conspiracy happened in Lori's apartment in Madison County rather than in Chad's backyard in Fremont County. Nonetheless, the prosecutors can tease out those things because they have to be two separate things in time. So, for example, you could have a crime where you were charged with, let's say you were charged with Tylee's murder in Madison County and JJ's murder in Fremont County. That could happen because they're actually two separate incidents. But in the case having to do with Murdaugh, the U.S. Supreme Court has said you can be tried for the same crime in two different jurisdictions because you're violating two different sets of laws. So in the case of the financial crimes, he was charged in, I think, 3 different counties in the Low Country. But he was also charged federally because the federal law is slightly different. And it's not double jeopardy. The US Supreme Court has said it is not double jeopardy to be charged for the same crime in 2 different jurisdictions if the criminal act constitutes a crime in both jurisdictions. So what happened was that they were not able to do these in the order that they would like to have done them, which would have meant that Alec Murdaugh would have ended up serving his sentences in federal prison. Now, we always called it the federal tennis camp, if that tells you anything about why he might want to be there. Typically, federal prisons have more white-collar criminals. There's not as many violent criminals within the system, and the conditions are usually better, more comfortable. And as we've seen with Corey Fleming, who I'll talk about in a minute, the sentences in state court are usually longer, quite a bit longer. So they would love to have Alec's murder case go back for a new trial. So that would mean that his conviction would be vacated. He would no longer be convicted. And then he would be, because he has been convicted in the state court crimes, he would go and serve in federal court. The way it works is whoever gets there first. So because the federal crime convictions came second, he has to serve his state court prison time before he can serve his federal court prison time. If his conviction in state court is vacated, then and only the federal conviction stands, then if and when he is reconvicted in the murders, that would get served concurrently with his federal crimes, which means that he probably would serve the bulk of his prison time in federal prison, a much more comfortable place. The other thing about the financial crimes is that in state court, if they bring them as 3 separate charges for the 3 separate counties, there is some sort of 3 strikes law in South Carolina that requires life without parole for the 3rd strike. So that's the reason why they're working so hard at this. So what happens if Becky Hill did actually make these comments to jurors? Well, I think that if there is even a suggestion that a juror could have been influenced by her, that Alec gets a new trial. Now, I'm not in the majority on that opinion. I mean, I think that if you talk to 10 different lawyers, you watch 10 different feeds on YouTube, you'll get 5 on one side and 5 on the other. But I think, now we have to remember it's South Carolina and they kind of go their own way sometimes. But I really do believe that if there is any suggestion that that was not a fair jury proceeding, that he gets a new trial. And I have some real concerns about some of the things that are in Becky Hill's book. She, at several different times, says very clearly that she expressed her opinion that he was guilty. And there's also some other sort of unusual things. This is a small town. Everybody knows everybody. Everybody are friends. And some unusual things happened, like somebody throwing her a birthday party, and all of the court staff and all of the attorneys being there. It just is in the law, we say you don't have to actually commit a wrong. You only have to give the appearance of impropriety, of doing something that is inappropriate. And there are many things in Becky's book and in things that I have heard since that don't pass the smell test. Now, that's hard because I don't like Harpootlian and Griffin. I don't like them. I don't like the way they conducted their case. I don't like the way they behave. I don't like the way they treat people. I don't like anything about either one of those guys. But Alec Murdaugh has a right to a fair and impartial jury. And if anybody did anything to influence that jury, which I have concerns about, then I think he gets a new trial, because I think our Constitution is so sacred that we have an obligation. If we want that Constitution to protect us, me, you, then we have to aggressively protect it when it comes to someone who we honestly in our gut believe is guilty. That's our system. That's the way that we function. This conversation came up at CrimeCon. So let me set the stage for you. And then we're going to go back and talk about Corey Fleming. But let me set the stage for you on this one. So this is a huge breakout room. There are probably easily 3,000 or 4,000 people in this room. Dick Harpootlian and Jim Griffin come in. Laura Ingram is the moderator. She comes in. She's asking them questions. They're projecting onto these huge big screens because there's so many people in this room. The stage is about this big from the back of the room. So they're projecting onto these big screens as the interviews are going on, and Laura Ingram interviews them. They don't particularly say anything more than what they've said before, although I have a real question about the ethics of lawyers who are actively representing a client going to an event like this and being invited to come and participate and talk about the case when there are pending motions and potentially a pending new trial. So I have some real questions with that. If it were not for the fact that it's very clear that the South Carolina bar is toothless and does nothing to restrain their bad acting lawyers until it becomes, international news. If it were any other state, I would have some real questions about whether or not Pootie and the Grifter were putting their law licenses on the line. So at the end of this session, they took some questions. One of the questions that came up is, how is Alec paying you? And they did a little bit of fancy footwork around it, but Dick Harpootlian's answer was, I make enough money and I'm in this for the long haul, and I'm not going to leave a client in the lurch, so it doesn't matter whether we're getting paid or not. He made it sound like they were not particularly getting paid, but he also was vague enough that I think I would have some real questions. But then somebody stood up and said, how do you defend somebody as reprehensible as Alec Murdaugh? And I was super disappointed that this question came up because it gave Dick Harpootlian the opportunity to get on his high horse and talk about the Constitution and talk about how sacred protecting someone's rights is. And it allowed him to get on his high horse. And it was unfortunate because that's the way that the session ended, was with him sort of ending on that high note of being this person who was protecting somebody's fundamental constitutional rights. So I don't know. I didn't love the fact that they were there. I thought that it was kind of crass, that it was probably inadvisable for them to be there talking about. It's one thing for a lawyer to come and to talk in generalities or to talk about other cases, but the very fact that they were there talking about the case where they actively represent a defendant who has open matters before the court, I thought was a little bit shocking. So just before CrimeCon began, there was a court appearance in front of Judge Newman. And the court appearance was sort of a status conference for Alec to figure out when the state financial crimes were going to come to trial, to set a hearing on the issue of the jury tampering. And then it was also a time for Corey Fleming, who was Alec's good friend and lawyer, who he sent the Satterfields to and the Pinckneys to because they were because he couldn't represent them because he already represented somebody else in the case. And so he was there. He pled guilty to all of the charges in both federal and state court. Now, he was charged in federal court, and they worked out a deal where he was really only pleading to one count in federal court. So they messed around with the charges until it was one count for all of his crimes in federal court. And the federal court, after listening to a lengthy pre-sentence report and many people from the community talking about what a great guy Corey Fleming was, the judge in the federal court, who could have given him up to 20 years, gave him 7. And said on the record, and I am encouraging the judge in the state court action to follow suit and to follow along with the federal sentence. Well, that did not set well with Judge Newman. And so he said, horse feathers, I am not going to do that. And he sentenced Corey Fleming to 20 years. This is the difference between federal and state court. State courts, very typically, the sentences are much longer than federal courts. Federal courts have developed this sentencing guideline matrix, and they did not get wrapped up into the same tough on crime, victims' rights sort of matrix that came about in the 90s. So many states, including Idaho, including my home state of Oregon, including Arizona, where I lived, they all have, during those timeframes, they had victims' rights advocates who were saying, we need steeper penalties for violent crimes. We need longer sentences for certain crimes. And so the pendulum sort of swung in the direction of much longer sentences and much more stringent requirements around it. So a lot of them have the equivalent of what Oregon had was ballot measure 11, which said for these specified crimes, which were typically the most serious and violent crimes, there is a mandatory sentencing matrix that the court cannot deviate from. If you are convicted, you get X years, and the judge doesn't have any discretion to depart from that sentence. Additionally, the people are not allowed for any time off for good behavior, for good time, and they're not allowed any participation in any rehabilitative programs. To my way of thinking, it's somewhat counterintuitive that you're not going to give inmates with long sentences any incentive to behave themselves or to make them or better themselves. However, that's the law. And it is very common in a lot of states that have those kinds of sentencing matrices, sentencing regimes. And so the federal government never got wrapped into that. So when all of the states were lengthening their sentencing guidelines and their sentences were getting longer, the feds were still holding the line with what typical sentences had always been. And it created this big schism between state and federal sentencing, typical state and federal sentencing. So it's not a surprise that the federal government gave Corey Fleming 7 years, and the state court, he got 20. He is some of that time, some of his federal sentence runs concurrent with the 20-year sentence in state court, but Judge Newman made that consecutive and not concurrent. So he got 2 consecutive 10-year sentences. So for a total of 20 years. And it was interesting to see how that played out in that, because, excuse me, in Corey Fleming's case, because I think we may see something similar in Alec Murdaugh's case. Now, Murdaugh has 2 life without parole sentences in state court, and I don't anticipate that that's going to change. He may get a new trial, but I think the state's pretty confident that they are going to get a conviction. And so I think that I have been through all of the things that I wanted to talk to you all about. So it's probably time to take a few questions. And hi, Mary Howard. Thanks for this question. This is a good question because it points out an important point. Becky Hill has not been charged with anything. She has not been charged with any criminal activity, no crimes. What is happening right now is she is being accused of having tampered with a jury in a way that was inappropriate, and that was a violation of her oath of office as a public servant. But there are no criminal charges. So innocent until proven guilty doesn't really apply because she hasn't been charged with a crime. If she were, then we could say this. However, she's certainly being essentially tarred and feathered in the media. And I don't think it's fair to gang up on her or to pile on, because we don't really know what happened. I can tell you that there are things that she says in her book that I find troubling. I can tell you that there are things in the jurors' affidavits that, if they are true, I find troubling. But we have not had the next step is that the judge is required to have an evidentiary hearing. And at that hearing, the judge is required to take evidence and to determine whether it is more likely than not beyond a reasonable doubt, but whether it is more likely than not that that the jurors were impacted by comments that were made about the case. So I don't think we know enough now. But I think we're going to see an evidentiary hearing, and it's going to take some time, several days. And then the judge will have to decide whether he believes that there was jury tampering. But he's going to have to decide, first of all, whether he believes it happened, and second, whether or not it rises to the level of jury tampering. So those are things to watch, because that's what the evidentiary hearing is going to determine. So, good question. Hi, Trisha the trucker. I heard that you were in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and I'm glad that you were there safe and sound. I'm so glad Suzanne Morphew will finally get a proper funeral, and hopefully the person responsible for her death will finally be brought to justice. I agree entirely. It's always very troubling when you have a person who is missing, like my former client who disappeared from Bend, and the family has no answers. One of the folks who was at CrimeCon this year is a man who has been searching for his son. His son disappeared while right after I moved to Mesa, Arizona, and he was a young geologist. He was out on his job and disappeared in the desert, and he has never been found. His name is Daniel Robinson, and his lovely father was at CrimeCon, hoping to raise awareness for the continued search for him. We also have Dylan Rounds, who everyone knows that he was dry farming in Utah. And we know that the guy who was a squatter on his property has been arrested for his murder, but his body has never been found. And I think that is really tough. It's very difficult to get that sort of, I don't want to call it closure, because I don't really believe closure ever happens, but that sense of peace and maybe finality. And it's difficult to get that when you don't have those final answers. It's been difficult for Kay and Larry Woodcock, because the state still has not released Tylee and JJ's bodies so that they can have a memorial service for them and they can see them laid to rest. So I sincerely hope that whoever is responsible for Suzanne's death is brought to justice. And, I think it's doubly difficult when you're talking about a married couple with children, and now you have these young children who are essentially losing both their parents. So we don't know what is coming in terms of Barry Morphew, whether or not there is anything that can be, any information that can be derived from her autopsy that would point to who committed the crime. It's tough because it's 3 years ago, and Colorado has some very rough weather. And so she's been exposed to the elements for 3 years. So, but I hope, like you do, Trisha, that now she can be laid to rest. Thanks, and be safe out there. Thank you very much, Debbie Biggs. I want to take this time to talk a little bit about our moderator, Michelle. Those of you who know Michelle know that I'm not the only one she moderates for. I'm also not the only, and she runs our Facebook group, but that's not the only Facebook group she moderates. So she's very involved in the true crime community and has been a huge help to a lot of creators, not just me. She's indispensable to me, but she's also indispensable to a lot of folks. And I say we have the best folks in our chat every week, and a lot of that is because you all love and respect Michelle. And so when she's in the chat moderating, you enjoy talking to her, and you're kind and you're classy because that's how Michelle is. So for those of you who don't know, and I have Michelle's permission to share this, she has been pretty open about it on her personal social media, but for those of you who are not involved or don't follow her in her own personal social media, I want to bring you up to date because Michelle is having some pretty serious health struggles. She's fighting blood cancer, and at this point, this is a recurrence, and she is in the throes of the final stages of getting her treatment plan together and to starting this pretty grueling course of treatment. So I just want to let you all know that, because all of our donations, such as Debbie's very generous sticker, go directly to Michelle. From the time I started this channel, I have always shared all of the super chats, super stickers, PayPal donations with our moderators. They go directly to them. So anything you donate, that $19.99 that just came from Debbie is going to go right into Michelle's pocket. And I will tell you that she appreciates it more than I think she could ever say. She's on a fixed income. She has these health challenges. Right now, she's having to commute back and forth for her cancer treatment. And her granddaughter, lovely Emma, is living with her. So please send her your prayers, your good healing thoughts, to whatever higher power you recognize. Send her all that good healing juju. And if you can, please donate generously for her. And I want to tell you how much I appreciate all of you. I appreciate her and how hard she works for me, because she also does my Facebook group and does social media posting for me. And so I appreciate her tremendously, but I also appreciate what a community we are and how we come together and band together and support one another. And I think we have the best followers, and I think we have the best moderator, and I hope you will all agree and share a little bit with Michelle if you can. Please do not feel obligated, because we don't know what your situation is. Use your own best judgment. But if there is a little something you can share with Michelle, please do. Thank you so much for allowing me into your life every Wednesday. And thank you so much for your support and your kind words and your showing up every week with me. I appreciate it, because I know that you could be doing something else. So what other questions do you have for me, Michelle? Hi, Jerry McGrill. If there is a retrial, do you think they will sequester the jury? This is a good question, and it has come up. I've heard it discussed other places. Judge Newman was not overly inclined to sequester the jury. Prior to the trial beginning, Becky Hill did make arrangements for a block of rooms in case the judge decided to sequester the jury. It's a very expensive proposition to do, And Judge Newman felt that the jurors could live within the rules. Now, we know that there was one juror that it is alleged was having conversations with people about her jury service and about the facts of the case, and was replaced by an alternate juror later on. So we know it happens, but I really think that jurors want to do a good job, that they try really hard to follow the rules, and I believe that they that they do avoid being influenced by media, and that would be the main reason why you would want to sequester the jury. So I would say there's a less than 50-50 chance that that the judge would order the jury sequestered. Only because his opinion, I think, is we were successfully able to seat a jury last time. We should be able to successfully seat a jury this time, and we should be able to seat a jury that will follow my instructions. So, but I guess we'll see. Hi, Denicia. Will you cover the Maya versus JHACH? There's so much going on without the jury over evidence, specific wording of questions, and jury instructions. A breakdown would be appreciated. I've seen this case, but I hadn't delved into it. But now that you're asking, I will do so. Because it did seem like there were some interesting issues. And I'm happy to weigh in on the cases you're interested in. So I will put that on my list for next week. Thanks for asking. Crash D. You guys come up with some really interesting names. Question. Good Lori, could you please devote a newsletter or a show video on biggest differences between state court prison and federal court prison? I'm not so sure if anyone else is interested. I'm sure that people are interested. And I will say that it varies from state to state because of that pesky 14th Amendment state sovereignty. And it also is very different than if you are from another country. So I'll consider doing that. I have to tell you right now, I'm eyebrow deep in the Vallow book, and it's hard for me to sit down and shift my attention and write a newsletter and still do the preparation that I like to do for Wednesdays. So it's just been, I've been trying to preserve my writing bandwidth for the book, but I will take a look at that and see if I can carve out some time to do that. So thank you for asking. Hi again, Tricia. If Alec Murdaugh is granted a new trial, can they bring in the fact that he's been convicted of this crime previously, or do they have to leave that out? This is a really good question. They can't bring it in because what's happened is what the rules of evidence say is that you can bring in a conviction, okay? And the rule for prior convictions is different than just prior bad acts. So remember in the Vallow case, we had this whole issue about whether or not other bad acts that made her look bad and made people think, oh, maybe she's guilty here, could come in. And that had to do with Charles Vallow's murder. And they could say what the judge ruled was that information came in and her involvement came in, but they couldn't say that she'd been charged. So this would be a similar situation. The other thing is that if his conviction is overturned it has to be treated as if it didn't happen. So they would not be able to bring it in as a prior conviction. Now, could they say, and it's almost like double jeopardy. You can't say a prior jury convicted him of the murder of these two people. We're asking you to decide whether or not he's guilty of that same charge. So yeah, that it would be prejudicial and it would not come in. So, but it's different than if it is a prior bad act. Angel Baby. Do I think Barry is the most likely person? Is Barry Morphew the person who most likely killed Suzanne? You know, I don't know. I think that the evidence that links him to possibly to the murder is pretty circumstantial. And I think that I will say that we all know, and statistics show, and my experience shows that when a woman is murdered or is seriously injured, it is 90% more likely that's a terrible statistic, but it is incredibly much more likely that the person who inflicted that injury on her is an intimate partner. So from purely the statistical standpoint, I'd say, you know, the cards are stacked against Barry because we know that they had a rocky relationship. We know she was having an affair. We know he'd had affairs. We know things were not good between them. And we know that statistically it's more likely to be an intimate partner. But I don't know if we know enough about the circumstantial evidence and that chain of evidence to say for sure that there's a link, that there's a kind of ironclad, beyond a reasonable doubt link. So it may very well come out as the case goes along. If he is charged, clearly we'll get much more information about the state's case. So, good question. John and Carol Renner. Question: are you an attorney for Lori when you gave motions to Judge Bryce? Not Boyce. Not sure how that works for retired attorney giving motions. So, I took the position of any other citizen and member of the media. I did not file them as a lawyer. I filed them as a citizen of the state of Idaho and a member of the media. So I'm retired, and my licenses to practice law are inactive. And so I don't claim to be actively practicing law. However, I know how to write a motion, and I know how to file documents, and I know how to argue a motion. So I used my experience as a lawyer, and I drafted those documents. But I'm in no way represent anyone else involved in the case but myself as an interested citizen. So the motions were filed. I was called a non-party, a non-party movement, interested third party, basically. So I'm not a party to the case. The judge found that I was, for the purpose of the issues surrounding the documents, the sealed documents and the media, I was an interested party. So, but this is a good question. From the very beginning, I was very clear that I was acting in my role as a citizen of the state of Idaho, and that I was a private citizen, and I was filing those motions as a member of the media. And so it's interesting that there is sort of a split of opinion from state to state about how you go about doing that. So initially, because my experience has always been that the media files what's called a motion to intervene, a limited motion to intervene. And so that's what I filed. Judge Boyce came back and said, we don't recognize that in Idaho. If you want to be a non-party movement, you can file it under that title. And maybe it sounds a little bit like splitting hairs, but when you file a motion to intervene, technically you become a party to the case. A non-party movement doesn't technically become a party to the case. So recently in the Kohlberger case, the media has filed motions to intervene on the issue of cameras in the courtroom. And the judge has said, I don't think that in the state of Idaho is the proper filing. They're going to have to go back and do the same thing I did and file as a non-party movement. The law does allow interested parties. You don't have to be a lawyer. You just have to be someone who meets the definition of an interested party. Mostly that's media, to file motions in the case, even though they are not parties. So I hope that makes sense. But my filing motions to unseal documents did not make me a lawyer representing anybody in the case. Second question. Oh, you are more than welcome. I'm glad you asked the question, because if you had the question, somebody else does too. Did you follow Jonathan Quile's case, and why do you think the jury didn't give him the death penalty? I did not follow this case. It's not really even familiar, but I will look it up for next time. I'm making a note of it. Down the rabbit hole. Question. Did you talk about Dan Markel? I just jumped on your channel. I did talk about Dan Markel a little bit earlier, and be sure and go back and watch it. It is a case that is really of interest to me, and here's the reason why. My law practice, I did during the 27 years that I was in practice, I did both family law and criminal law, which is why my first book is a book about divorce for millennials. And so I'm very familiar with family law issues, child custody issues. I've tried a lot of child custody cases. And toward the end of my career, then was involved in a lot of child welfare cases where children were in foster care, child protective services kind of cases. So the Markel case is kind of in my wheelhouse, and it's been of interest to me from the very beginning. I am going to be on with Joel Waldman on Surviving the Survivor tomorrow. We'll post it as soon as he posts the link. I'm going to be on with him tomorrow talking about the Markel case. Joel has been very interested in the Markel case for quite some time. And it is really interesting that Charlie Adelson, who was Dan Markel's brother-in-law, Wendy Adelson's brother, is coming up for trial on the murder charges, on the charges that he arranged the murder for hire. That's coming up the 28th of October, and I will be all over that case. I have been actually toying with the idea that the Markel case could be my follow-on book. So I got to get the Vallow book written first. But there's a lot of what interests me about a story. If I'm going to write a book about it, there have to be some interesting issues that make it a really layered and nuanced kind of a case. So for me, there are some issues having to do with the child custody agreements. There's all the issues of a family that are way overly involved in one another's business. There's an element of a disagreement between Wendy and Danny about how their children were going to be raised. He was very observant Jew. She was much less observant, not really interested in being observant to the level that he was. That was a point of contention in their relationship. He was a law professor, a Harvard grad. I mean, there are a lot of things about that case that are super interesting to me. So I'm really sort of investigating whether, sorry, I'm by the end of a couple of hours, I'm just about out of voice. So I'm very interested in the case, and I'm very interested in that I'm doing some deep dives into whether or not that could be my next follow-on book. I've actually gone back and been listening to some of the trials for the gunman and the woman who was involved in arranging the connection. She was Charlie Adelson's girlfriend at one point and worked in the dental practice. She was the one who facilitated finding the gunman. So it's a really interesting case, has a lot of layers, and those are the kind of things I like if I'm going to write a book about them. So that's how I ended up with Lori Vallow. So let's, oh, good. Okay. Let's looks like Michelle's got that info out. I loved meeting Joel in person. I'd gotten to know him as another creator. I've appeared on his show several times, having to do with the Vallow case. And his mom, Carmela, is absolutely adorable. And she was at CrimeCon, so I got to get a little Carm time. And they're a really nice family, very nice folks. And I thoroughly enjoyed getting to know them in person. I also got to meet Phil Waters and Scott. Hang on. I have his card right here. Dephi, who appear every Friday on Joel's show. And they're both former law enforcement folks who always dig deeply into some interesting cases. So I had a blast at CrimeCon, got to see Gigi very briefly, got to meet her parents and Sarah Rose. They were there to celebrate Gigi's birthday, which was on Thursday of CrimeCon. And she was there to have a little bit of one-on-one Magic Kingdom time with Sarah Rose. And I was envious because Sarah Rose is still at the age where Disney is huge fun and still just a little magic. So I had a wonderful time while I was there. I met a lot of folks, of you folks who were in the chat. I saw a couple of folks come up and say they were happy to have run into me at CrimeCon. So I got a chance to meet a few folks. Next year, we're going to have a booth. We're going to be doing book pre-sales. We're going to be handing out swag. We are going to be there in force. So plan on it. I'm probably going to tell you every time we have a live. It is May 31st through June 2nd in Nashville, Tennessee. And I'm looking forward to being in Nashville because I have never been there before. And so I'm hoping to take a little bit of time around CrimeCon and do a little exploring down there. Thanks so much for being with us. Michelle, do we have any other questions or are we ready? Oh, are the correction guards openly displaying the Odin patches? This is a good question. According to the defense, I thought you couldn't have anything other than standard insignia on correction uniforms. You know, I kind of thought so too. But according to the defense, these guys were wearing Odin patches and patches that had the rune on it that represents Odin. Now, I mean, I don't know why they would say that if they couldn't back it up, but they allege that when Richard Allen first was in prison, they were openly wearing those patches. And it wasn't until his defense team started coming in routinely and they got wind of the fact that the defense team may have heard the story that this Odin cult could be involved. When the corrections officers found out or got wind of the fact that the defense might be onto them, the patches disappeared. At least that's what the defense alleges in that 136-page motion. So there is a tremendous amount of very specific information in those 136 pages. And a lot of it is stuff that we did not know before. A lot of it is stuff that law enforcement held back because of not wanting to compromise the investigation. So, but it's all out there now. And there's a lot of information. For one thing, the girls were not killed with a gun. So it's weird that there was an unspent bullet there. And it's weird that that unspent bullet was under leaves and not right on top. It's weird that that the scene was staged, that it was clear from the description in the motion that the scene was staged, and the defense alleges that it was staged symbolically to represent the runes that identify Odin. So, you know, I mean, there are two sides to every story. All you got to do is raise reasonable doubt. And I mean, I have to say, I have some doubt. We have talked at length before about junk science and about whether or not ballistics can be that reliable. Now, what we know is if a bullet is fired out of a rifle, there are many more ways to analyze that bullet and to link it to the barrel of the gun. But in this case, this was an unspent bullet. Now, you might remember in Murdoch, they had this same issue. This was an unfired bullet. And what they said was that particular bullet had markings on it that indicated that it had been run through a gun. So when you put a bullet in a gun, there is a mechanism that if you don't fire that bullet, extracts the bullet back out. And the extractor marks, the little grabber that grabs the bullet and pulls it back out, are what they're looking at. And there is way less. We have databases that talk about similarities in guns, but we don't have any sort of a database that says this gun with this serial number has this kind of extractor that left these marks that are like a fingerprint or like DNA, and to the exclusion of any other gun. That is not happening with extractor marks. There is no way to know how often those extractor marks could be duplicated by the same model gun, a different serial number. So when you are talking about ballistics of a fired bullet, you're talking about matching up the markings inside the barrel of a specific gun with the markings that are on the outside of the bullet that fired out of that specific gun. So you're matching a one-to-one thing. If you're talking about extractor marks, you can really say is that bullet ran through a gun with the characteristics of the extractor in Richard Allen's gun. But there is no way to know how many of guns of that same model are out there and could leave those same extractor marks. And there's no database for that. And there's no real statistical analysis on it. So extractor marks are much more smoke and mirrors than an actual ballistics. Hopefully, I went way farther than your question. Hey, Squeaky Wheel, how are you? How long would it take a judge to go through that 136-page motion and sort out what is fact and what is fiction? How would the judge possibly verify any of it? This is a good question. So what is going to happen is they're going to have an evidentiary hearing, just the same as we're going to have an evidentiary hearing in Murdoch. What's going to happen is all of those allegations that are in that motion, the defense is going to bring in witnesses, and they're going to put witnesses on that are going to testify about what is in the motion. So they're going to bring in law enforcement. They're going to bring in all those other folks, the people who they've taken depositions of. All of those folks are going to be brought to trial, to court, to testify in an evidentiary hearing. And then the judge will have to decide whether the evidence that's been presenting to him proves that it's more likely than not that the warrant was deficient. So, and that's why they paid the judges the big bucks, right? But the judge will get a presentation of testimony from witnesses. It won't just be 136 pages of allegations. There'll be sworn testimony that'll come in. And then the judge will have to, just the way the jury would, the judge will have to weigh the credibility of the testimony and make a determination. And that's what judges do. They call balls and strikes. Any more questions, anybody? Otherwise, we'll call it a night. Thanks so much for joining us. Thank you so much for your generosity for Michelle. I appreciate it more than I can ever say. A couple of last little details. Look for our True Crime Quilt Guild raffle coming up. I'm shooting to open the raffle the 1st of October. So look for that. And I will get some more information out to you as soon as I can. I still have not heard back from the pattern maker on the origami quilt, the origami crane quilt for the woodcocks, but I'm going to keep pursuing that. And if I don't get information from them soon, we'll start looking for a different pattern, something similar. It's just that pattern square worked well. And so I wanted to use it if we possibly could. So, but don't give up hope. We're going to do it. And probably after the 1st of the year, when things calm down and it's winter time and everyone's quilting. So I want to say thanks again for joining us. Thank you, Michelle, for always being my faithful sidekick. Thank you for all of you who donated tonight. And thanks for all of your comments. Thanks. Please remember, subscribe, hit the like button, leave your comments below if you have questions that we didn't get to tonight, or if you're just not comfortable posting them in the chat, you can always post them in the comments or email me. And there is a bunch of stuff in our show notes. So if you haven't looked at our show notes lately, I add stuff all the time, links and other interesting things. So be sure and check that out. I'm going to say good night. Have a great week. It's feeling like fall a little bit around Idaho. It's feeling like sweatshirts and shorts weather. For those of you who live in the high desert, you know what that's like. I'm going to say good night. Have a great week.